So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Natalie Walker. I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 7 through 12, and now 3 through 6 as well. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. 2/3 of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, to help us develop a true common canon, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author from the CLT bank. Tonight, that author is G.K. Chesterton, and that partner college is Palm Beach Atlantic University. Palm Beach Atlantic is located in West Palm Beach, a city which ranked 20th on Forbes' list of best places for job growth. In addition to incredible job opportunities, PBA's setting in South Florida, as you can imagine, is also beautiful, and the recreation and entertainment is hard to beat. But beyond its setting, there's an energy, environment, and community at PBA unlike any other college or university in America. For one thing, PBA is guided by its Christian values. Their academic offerings, which include over 70 undergraduate majors, are proven and respected by top employers and elite graduate institutions. And last thing I'll point out, the student to faculty ratio of 12:1 means their faculty will mentor you at PBA, and that's ultimately where an education happens, in conversation with a mentor. We have one of those exceptional faculty members with us tonight. Dr. Eric Tippin is Assistant Professor of English at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His research focuses on the essay, on theories of prose style, and on short forms such as the aphorism and the list. He has published on figures from Louisa May Alcott to G.K. Chesterton to Oscar Wilde. There will be time after Dr. Tippin's lecture for questions, so keep your questions close and I will be fielding those from the chat. Feel free to put them there at any time. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tippin. We're grateful to have you here. Screen is yours.
Thanks so much. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about Chesterton. I did my PhD at least in part on him, so I know him well and like to talk about him. I'll be focusing on one aspect of his writing and thinking, but I think this is the aspect that matters most. It's the aspect that helps us understand all the rest of what he's doing in all of his novels and short stories and essays and poems. But first, let's talk about Chesterton as a person. He was born in 1874. Now, this is interesting because it means that he grew up in probably the most literate society the world has ever known. So between kind of 1880 to 1920, well, by 1900, about 95% of people in Britain could read. Just for perspective, when the Reformation happened, it was about 15 to 20%. So not very many could actually read the Bible when they were calling for people to read it. But by 1900, about 95% of Britons could read. And of course, radio hadn't come in yet, television hadn't come in yet. And so everyone could read and everyone did read. So it was the most literate society, even more literate than our own society, that you could possibly be born into. I mean, Chesterton, like his middle-class contemporaries, read voraciously. He couldn't read until age 8. He was kind of slow in a lot of ways early on, or seemed to be slow. I think it was more of an appearance than a reality. But once he started reading, he read voraciously. So he says this in one of his in one of his essays. He says, "I had a mere brute pleasure of reading, a pleasure in leisurely and mechanical receptiveness. It was the sort of pleasure that a cow must have in grazing all day long." So you get the sense from him that he grew up kind of in an idyllic childhood. He had a happy childhood, loving parents, kind of all the best that the English middle classes could give him at the time. He also started writing at an early age, and he and his friends started their own paper, which was typical of the time. And he would write poems and things, and you get a good sense of his religious sensibilities in his early poetry. So this is the last poem he wrote for this little periodical that he and his friends put out as a sort of school paper. These are some lines from it. "Hail Mary, thou blessed among women, generation shall rise up to greet. After ages of wrangles and dogma, I come with a prayer to thy feet, where Gabriel's red plumes were a wind in the lanes of thy lilies at eve. We love who have done with the churches. We worship who may not believe. So you get the kind of double sense in this early poem. He's about 18 when he wrote it. That Chesterton appreciated Christianity, saw it as something beautiful, something worthwhile, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it, which was typical of the English middle classes at the end of the 19th century. But unlike a lot of his contemporaries, he did move into belief eventually. And this belief all started with, I think, a bit of an odd sense that Chesterton had of the strangeness of his own existence. He just looked around the world and thought how odd everything is, and how odd it is to be alive. And so he sort of founded his philosophy early on, if you read his early journals and things, on the idea that the world is strange and it's odd to be alive, and what do we do about this? He puts it this way in his autobiography. I invented a rudimentary and makeshift mystical theory of my own. It was substantially this, that even mere existence, reduced to its primary limits, was extraordinary enough to be exciting. Anything was magnificent as compared with nothing. Even if the very daylight were a dream, it was a daydream. It was not a nightmare. The mere fact that one could wave one's arms and legs about, or those dubious external objects in the landscape which were called one's arms and legs, show that it had not the mere paralysis of a nightmare. I hung on to the remains of religion by one thin thread of thanks. I thanked whatever gods might be for my own soul and my own body, even if they could be conquered. So long before the 20th century philosopher Heidegger kind of asked the question, why is there not nothing, which was one of his fundamental questions. Why is there anything at all? Chesterton, as a sort of young man, was already asking the question. And this became the foundation of his thinking, of kind of everything he did. All of his fiction, all of his essays began with this sense of wonder at existence itself. I mean, this is what brought him to the Christian faith by his own account. But it also forms his work as a writer. It informs the way he writes sentences, which we'll see later on. So he embeds this idea in everything he writes, in all of his word choices, and all of his in all of his syntax. So here's what I intend to do over the next few minutes. I want to talk about this idea that Chesterton had of the strangeness of existence. And I want to do that through a term that Chesterton didn't himself use, but I think it's really useful to think about what Chesterton does as a writer. And that term is defamiliarization or estrangement. Now, this term comes to us actually through Russian thinkers. The Russian formalist school gave this idea of defamiliarization or estrangement. Primarily a guy called Viktor Shklovsky, who was a Russian formalist critic. And he had a very famous essay, a well-known essay that you may encounter in your studies, called Art as Device. And he explains defamiliarization or estrangement this way. This is how life becomes nothing and disappears. Automation eats things, clothes, furniture, your wife, and the fear of war. And so this thing we call art exists in order to restore the sensation of life, in order to make us feel things, in order to make a stone stony. The goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The device of art is the estrangement of things and the complication of the form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception, as the process of perception is in art an end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is the means to live through the making of a thing. What has been made does not matter in art. Now, Chesterton, as you might expect, says something very similar in his autobiography. Here it is. He says, at the back of our brains, so to speak, there was a forgotten blaze or burst of astonishment at our own existence. The object of the artistic and spiritual life was to dig for this submerged sunrise of wonder, so that a man sitting in a chair might suddenly understand that he was actually alive and be happy. So Chesterton wants to be surprised at the fact that we exist, and he says that all art is directed to that end, to surprise people. But the fact is that most people are bored with existence. Maybe you've come across the term acedia or akadia. That is a sort of indifference towards the large questions in life, or a kind of existential boredom. This seems to be the resting posture of most people, and so Chesterton made it his project to jolt people out out of this sense of boredom with existence, to give them what he considered to be a true understanding of the real. And once you understand truly how strange and mysterious the real is, then you'll never be bored again, and eventually you'll sort of be led down the path to belief. And in order to do this, in order to sort of jolt people out of this sense of boredom at existence itself, Chesterton, his habitual practice in all of his work is reversal. He takes two things that we expect to be in one place, and he sticks them in different places, often in opposite places, and then forces us to kind of think about it. And it makes us see these things in a new way. We'll talk later about one of his stylistic techniques that does this. But just in terms of ideas, he'll say things like Nietzsche's vision of the strong man and Übermensch, the overman, the superman, is actually a weak person. So Nietzsche calls it strength and Chesterton calls it weakness. He'll say things like repetition is a sign of strength and variation is a sign of weakness. He says that that rationality is the road to madness and mysticism is the road to sanity. Again, we would expect the opposite. He says that heresy is dull and orthodoxy is romantic. He says that moral limits are the only way to be truly free. So limitations are a way to free yourself. Again, that's a reversal. He says that lawyers and businessmen are narrow drudges and mothers are the real heroes of society. So again, he sort of takes the things we expect or the things we think we believe, and he puts them in opposite places and forces us to think about it. It's a way to defamiliarize our existence. Now, you should recognize this mode of thought from reading scripture. The Bible and Jesus do this all the time. They say the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and that the servant of all shall be the head of all, and that a little child shall lead them. So reversal and paradox is a sort of key feature of biblical rhetoric, and Chesterton uses it as well in his own work. And this defamiliarization, this reversal of things in order for us to see them new, is the thing which led Chesterton to Christianity. And he explains how this works in his seminal work of Christian apologetics, Orthodoxy. So I'll kind of take you through the argument, how we get from defamiliarization to Christianity. In Orthodoxy, he tries to convince his readers that the things that we consider to be normal and even dull are not. And he does this with all kinds of things. But this is probably a key passage. It's fairly long, but it's worth reading it all. This is where he talks about the question of repetition and the question of natural laws. He says, all the towering materialism which dominates the modern mind rests ultimately upon one assumption, a false assumption. It is supposed that if a thing goes on repeating itself, it is probably dead, a piece of clockwork. People feel that if the universe was personal, it would vary. If the sun were alive, it would dance. It might be true that the sun rises regularly because he never gets tired of rising. His routine might be due not to a lifelessness, but to a rush of life. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children, when they find some game or joke that they especially enjoy. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony, but perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. So once you reject the notion that things automatically must be as they are, that things go by sort of mechanical laws like Newton posited, then you have a much more exciting universe in which, as St. Paul says, all things consist in God. He says that in Colossians, or in Acts 17, when he's at the Acropolis, he says, in him, meaning God, we live and move and have our being, that he upholds kind of everything at all times. And Chesterton suggests that not only does he uphold things at all times, he enjoys all things at all times and enjoys them as they are. Now, it's no coincidence that at the same time Chesterton's writing this, Quantum physics is being sort of theorized at the beginning of the 20th century, and quantum physics says something very similar, actually, that when you look very closely at tiny particles or very large particles, the laws change. It's not a mechanical universe like Newton thought it was. It's a much more mysterious and odd thing that changes when we look at it and changes when we measure it. And Chesterton was already sort of intuiting this, even though he didn't have any specific knowledge of quantum physics. So when you start to realize that things are not inevitable, they stop becoming boring. Repetition can be a sign of life. It doesn't have to be a sign of death. And everything becomes kind of strange and wonderful, at least according to Chesterton. So for Chesterton, this kind of fundamental defamiliarized wonder at our own existence leads to gratitude, to thankfulness. We did not give ourselves our own existence. Existence is a gift. We didn't make ourselves. It's kind of a fundamental rule of being human. So if, like Chesterton, we are pleased about having arms and legs and fingernails and the fact that grass is green and the sky is blue and apples are sweet, we probably want to thank the person who gave these things to us. But thank whom? Exactly. This was Chesterton's question. If you read the ancient philosopher Confucius, he says that we should thank our parents first. They gave us life. They gave us our bodies, also our ancestors, of course. And he's right to a certain extent. Most of the good things we have are kind of gifts to us from the dead and from our family. But Chesterton wants to ask something kind of even more fundamental. Our parents did not give us the world as we find it. Waterfalls and animals and oceans and fruit and honey and mountains and kind of all the nice things that are external to us. Who gave us these? So if we're pleased at having these, whom can we thank for them as a gift? And this is Chesterton's fundamental question. So he puts it this way in Orthodoxy. I felt grateful, though I hardly knew to whom. Children are grateful when Santa Claus puts in their stockings gifts of toys or sweets. Could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he put in my stockings the gift of 2 miraculous legs? We can thank people for birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for the birthday present of birth? That birthday present of birth is a typical stylistic move for Chesterton, where, again, he's sort of putting birth in a place we wouldn't necessarily expect it. We expect it to come before present, but he's putting it after. So it's another form of reversal. And of course, the answer to his question that he came to eventually, the Christian answer is that God made the world and holds it together. He's given us all these gifts and we can thank him. And from this thankfulness comes our desire to do good. So Chesterton moves from thankfulness to God to a moral vision of the world. This is the example he gives for sexual morality. And he puts it well. Again, there's a kind of defamiliarizing vision. He says, keeping to one woman is a small price for so much as seeing one woman. To complain that I could only be married once was like complaining that I had only been born once. It was incommensurate with the terrible excitement of which one was talking. It showed not an exaggerated sensibility to sex, but a curious insensibility to it. A man is a fool who complains that he cannot enter Eden by 5 gates at once. Polygamy is a lack of the realization of sex. It is like a man plucking 5 pears in mere absence of mind. Men, I felt, might fast 40 days for the sake of hearing a blackbird sing. Men might go through fire to find a cowslip, yet these lovers of beauty could not even keep sober for the blackbird. They would not go through common Christian marriage by way of recompense to the cowslip. Surely one might pay for extraordinary joy in ordinary morals. So Christian morality comes for Chesterton from that sense of gratefulness, thankfulness, that someone has given us a gift. And when someone gives us a gift, we want to respond in kind, not necessarily out of obligation, but because we want to. That's the gift economy, not the kind of transactional market economy. And that's what makes morality meaningful for us, that we're responding to a gift of God to us. And it's kind of silly to want something different. If he's given us everything from our birth to all the things that we enjoy, to ask for something different would be strange, rather than just responding with obedience. So the rules of Christianity are kind of nothing to the gift of existence itself for Chesterton. So wonder at existence leads to thankfulness, and thankfulness leads to a God to whom to be thankful, which leads for Chesterton to a desire to please him and follow his laws. But this is where a problem comes in. Most people object that those laws are limiting, that they keep us from being free and making our own decisions. One of the great ideals of 19th century classical liberalism, of course, was the individual making choices. You see this in John Stuart Mill, or in Ralph Waldo Emerson. I am the, or in W.E. Henley, I am the captain of my fate, I am the master of my soul, or something like that. So kind of making our own choices, and people object that Christian laws and morals keep us from doing that. But Chesterton says no, this, and kind of deploys another reversal to combat this idea. He says Catholic, but he means Christian. He means, I think he's using it in its small c sense, that is universal. Catholic doctrine and discipline may be walls, but they are the walls of a playground. Christianity is the only frame which has preserved the pleasure of paganism. We might fancy some children playing on the flat grassy top of some tall island in the sea. So long as there was a wall around the cliff's edge, they could fling themselves into every frantic game and make the place the noisiest of nurseries. But the walls were knocked down, leaving the naked peril of the precipice. They did not fall over, but when their friends returned to them, they were all huddled in terror in the center of the island, and their song had ceased. So he's saying that the rules that Christianity gives us, the laws, the dogmas, the doctrines, are not like walls keeping us from something really pleasant. They're like walls keeping us from something awful, from the abyss, from something that would end us. And those walls can free us to move. Whereas if you take them down, then you're actually limited, more limited than you would be otherwise. So here's another reversal. Submission to Christian doctrines and dogmas and morals is actually a way to maximize your freedom for Chesterton. And again, all this started from the fundamental defamiliarization of finding existence and reality strange. So these are the steps he goes through. But, says Chesterton, one can only kind of maintain this sense of defamiliarized existence if one is humble. So for him, the virtue that leads most to happiness, leads most to kind of well-being, is humility, which of course is true, because pride is the original sin. It keeps you from seeing things as they are. He says this: by asking for pleasure, he lost the chief pleasure. For the chief pleasure is surprise. Hence, it became evident that if a man would make his world large, he must be always making himself small. Even the haughty visions, the tall cities, and the toppling pinnacles are the creations of humility. Giants that tread down forests like grass are the creations of humility. Towers that vanish upwards above the loneliest star are the creations of humility. For towers are not tall unless we look up at them, and giants are not giants unless they are larger than we. All this gigantesque imagination, which is perhaps the mightiest of the pleasures of man, is at the bottom entirely humble. It is impossible without humility to enjoy anything, even pride. In other words, unless we're willing to admit that the world is beyond us, beyond our explanation, that there are things that we can't explain, that we are too small to encase the world in our own brains, we'll always be kind of limited. We won't be able to enjoy the world as it is, or see the world in its kind of real state. That is a sort of strange, mysterious thing that's beyond us. So that's Chesterton's vision of defamiliarization. But Chesterton is also a writer. And defamiliarization isn't simply an idea in his work. It's the way he thinks through sentences. Let me explain. We see this reversal of things in the way he writes clauses in his work, specifically in his deployment of a technique called chiasmus. You may have heard this before. This is a technique in which you take two words from a clause, you say the clause, and then you switch them. The most famous example, of course, in American history is John F. Kennedy's speech, in which he says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So he takes country and you, he just reverses them in subsequent clauses, and we get a new thought. It's surprising, it's compact, it's pleasing in its own sort of way. So Chesterton deploys this probably more than any essayist that I've encountered in the 20th century. He uses it constantly, and it's no coincidence that he uses it constantly, because this is the very thing that he's been doing with ideas all along, defamiliarizing ideas by kind of making them change places, weakness is strength, poverty or riches, and all the rest. So here's a good example from his book, St. Francis of Assisi. And I've bolded the words for your benefit. The transition from the good man to the saint is a sort of revolution by which one for whom all things illustrate and illuminate God becomes one for whom God illustrates and illuminates all things. It is rather like the reversal whereby a lover might say at first sight that a lady looked like a flower, and say afterwards that all flowers reminded him of his lady. So notice, it's fairly simple. In chiasmus, this is a kind of obvious example that Chesterton needs to make the point that shifting from a simply kind of good person to a saint is a revolution. Now, revolution is exactly the right word choice, because what does it mean? It just means to turn, right? And what does he do with his sentences following? He flips them, he turns them. So there's a literal revolution happening in his own syntax that allows him to get us to sort of shift the vision in which God is a sort of secondary thing to God being a primary thing, that God illustrates and illuminates all things rather than other things illustrating and illuminating God. So he makes a fine distinction here really efficiently, and chiasmus is good at that. But he also kind of gives us a picture of the very thing that he's talking about. And in the process, defamiliarizes things like ladies and flowers and all kinds of things. Of course, chiasmus is, as novel theorists will tell you, also a kind of archetypal plot structure. And Chesterton uses this in his stories and novels a lot. For example, in his novel The Man Who Was Thursday, which came out about the same time as Orthodoxy, about 1908, the anarchists turn out to be police, and the police turn out to be anarchists. The world is in this kind of chiastic movement constantly. And this is true in a lot of his novels, and true of a lot of kind of good novels in general. Now, how does this tie into defamiliarization? Well, chiasmus is a great way of seeing things twice. I mentioned quantum physics earlier. There have been a number of interesting experiments in quantum physics, none of which I understand very well, in which things sort of snap into existence when you look at them, or they change when you look at them, and they change fundamentally when you look at them twice, or so seeing something or seeing it twice changes them. And Chesterton does this. He says, I want you to look at this idea of a flower and a lady, but I want you to look at it twice, and when you see it the second time, it's going to be different. And Chesterton is always trying to urge his readers to look at things again, look at them again, and if you look at them enough, then you'll find them strange. We understand this with things like semantic saturation, in which if you say your name over and over again, Bob, 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 eventually Bob starts to sound like a nothing word, like a thing that doesn't make sense. It's called semantic saturation. And Chesterton is doing this with chiasmus, because there's the sort of basic fact that chiasmus forces you to see the word multiple times. So having to see it over and over again forces you to look at it in a new way. It defamiliarizes the word itself, and hopefully it defamiliarizes the concept that the word stands in for. So that is chiasmus, but he has other techniques as well that he deploys. One of them is, well, I suppose the most important one is sonic bonds. And that is that Chesterton tends to maximize the potential similarity in sound between different words. And in many ways, this style choice is really closely linked to his use of chiasmus, because it works to a similar end. I mean, it helps us to see words again and differently through the lens of other words that are similar. I mean, the most common way that Chesterton does this to sort of show the semantic similarity between words is alliteration, and then which is the repetition of consonants in a word. So bad boy or something like, I don't know, or assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds. And again, when you see these things, it draws attention to the words. It forces you to look at them again. And hopefully in Chesterton's vision, it's a good way of seeing things again. Here's a good example. One of the more obvious examples from his work. This is from his book on Chaucer, and he's trying to explain the similarity or the connection between St. Thomas Aquinas and Chaucer and their two different visions of the world. He says this: the meaning of Aquinas is that medievalism was always seeking a center of gravity. The meaning of Chaucer is that when found, it was always a center of gaiety. Okay, so we get those two words, gravity and gaiety, and if you were to look those words up in the Oxford English Dictionary or any other good dictionary, you would find that they have no semantic links to each other. It's just a kind of serendipitous, coincidental link between gravity and gaiety. And yet Chesterton sort of picks those two words and lets them sort of feed into each other and shows us that maybe there's a similarity between them, that maybe the world is so strange that two things that seem to be unrelated, like gravity and gaiety, just simply by sounding similar, can kind of teach us something new. Again, it forces us to look at these words again and understand them in light of each other. And just the sound similarity between them helps us understand, even in a kind of non-semantic way, that what Aquinas is trying to do, that is sort of having a center of gravity for Christian thinking, and what Chaucer is trying to do, that is kind of that festive, happy medieval culture, that those two things are actually aligned. And that sonic bond shows us that. And by sonic, I mean sound, of course. So here is elsewhere Chesterton becomes a kind of likes to use sound as a kind of binding force between things that are other separate. Let's look at a couple more examples, if we can, of this. He says this: "The child is positively in love with limits. He deliberately deprives this world of half of its paving stones in order to exult in a challenge that he has offered to himself." Okay, this is not a particularly compelling moment in Chesterton's writing. And when we're reading it in its context and its speed, we may not see the kind of minimal alliteration of love and limits, and yet love and limits have a kind of similarity to them, right? So the child is positively in love with limits. He deliberately deprives the world of half of its paving stones in order to exult in a challenge he has offered to himself. And just putting those two words next to each other and choosing the word love and limits gives us a sense that those things might be linked up and forces us to look at those words again. And that's what Chesterton's stylistic technique is all about. One more example here, and I like this one a lot. It comes from Chesterton's very brilliant essay, worth looking up, on the Book of Job. It's one of his best. And he says this: "Verbally speaking, the enigmas of Jehovah seem darker and more desolate than the enigmas of Job. Yet Job was comfortless before the speech of Jehovah and is comforted after. He has been told nothing, but he feels the terrible tingling atmosphere of something which is too good to be told." Okay, so again, this just seems like an interesting passage in which he's trying to show that even though God only answers Job with questions, Job feels comforted. What do we do about this? But notice his word choice. He might have written God rather than Jehovah, but he chose that word instead. And Jehovah sounds plausibly like a kind of extension somehow of the word Job. So he's showing this sort of similarity between Job, the creation, and Jehovah, the God. So he's kind of doing the thing that he says, that there's a special analogical relationship between Job and Jehovah. There's this closeness, this bond, which we get by the end, that he's telling the story of Job, that at the beginning Job feels far away from God, and by the end he's close, even in the way they sound. So it's subtle, but Chesterton is always using these subtleties to push his agenda, as it were. Okay, so that's just a couple of stylistic techniques, but he's using reversal all the time. I showed it with the birthday gift of birth thing. Look for it when you're reading him. He reverses in his sentences a lot, and it gives you this slightly vertiginous feeling, this feeling of dizziness when you're reading him, but it's supposed to give you that. It's supposed to jolt you into this sense of strangeness. Now, one last thing to say about Chesterton and defamiliarization, and hopefully you've picked this up, is that he's very funny, and Chesterton is a funny thinker from beginning to end. And this is another way that he kind of sees the world new. He finds them funny. When we find something funny, often it's a way of seeing it in a new way. So for instance, when we see our brother or sister kind of fall on a banana skin, we're sort of seeing them in a new light, and we find that funny. So it's a way of sort of seeing them again. And Chesterton does this with concepts. He constantly makes them funny. I think it's part of his project. But there's also a danger in this. I think a lot of us have been patterned to dismiss anything that's funny or light as lightweight, or even sort of dangerous, those things that make us laugh, that you're not really doing serious philosophical work if you're being funny. But I think this misunderstands what Chesterton's trying to do and how important humor is to Chesterton's project. For him, humor is the kind of fundamental reality. Of course, a kind of classic comedy, in the Aristotelian sense, is supposed to sort of end in order, and humor has ties to that as well. Fundamentally, for Chesterton, we're sort of living in a comedy that is something that ends happily, something that ends well. And so his appeal to humor is a way to reassert the idea that the world is fundamentally good, and happy and worthwhile, even though it seems terrible sometimes. Actually, the person who put this best was not Chesterton, but C.S. Lewis, who's a good reader of Chesterton, which I guess I don't have that slide, but I'll read it to you. He says this: Chesterton's humor was the kind which I like best. Not jokes embedded in the page like currants in a cake, still less what I cannot endure, a general tone of flippancy and jocularity, but the humor which is not in any way separable from the argument, but is rather the bloom on the dialectic itself. The sword glitters not because the swordsman set out to make it glitter, but because he is fighting for his life, and therefore moving very quickly. For the critics who think Chesterton frivolous or paradoxical, I have to work hard to feel even pity. Sympathy is out of the question. So he's suggesting, and I think it's true, that humor is fundamental to his whole way of seeing the world, of defamiliarizing the world, of jolting us out of our dogmatic slumbers, as it were. Now, let me just close with this last defamiliarizing passage that I find kind of both funny and profound and philosophically moving, kind of all at the same time. He says this in his book Heretics, which is the one that he put out before Orthodoxy. The best way that a man could test his readiness to encounter the common variety of mankind would be to climb down a chimney into any house at random and get on as well as possible with the people inside. And that is essentially what each one of us did on the day he was born. So this is again, it's funny. It's kind of a strange picture of birth, of sort of being tossed down a random chimney and having to get along with people inside. But it captures some of the more serious philosophical questions, existential questions of the 20th century. Martin Heidegger, whom I mentioned earlier, puts forward an idea that he calls Geworfenheit, which in German means something like flungness or thrownness. And he says that everyone who was born as this is Heidegger speaking, that everyone who was born has this sense of being flung into the world, not thrown in a controlled sort of baseball way, but flung into existence, and you're sort of spinning, and you have to deal with the fact that you show up, and that you exist. And this is one of the great problems, is kind of dealing with that question of existence itself, that flungness. And Chesterton is taking that and he's turning it into something funny. He's turning it into something pleasant. Notice that a person is not being flung out into a random place. He's being flung into a household. The family sits at the center of all this, which is a very sort of Christian Catholic way of seeing it. So for Heidegger, you sort of, this is a horrible reality, or something that you have to grapple with, and that's partially true. But for Chesterton, it's a kind of comic reality. It's the possibility for good. It's the possibility for family. So he's taking that question of alienation, which Karl Marx gives us, that alienation from labor, alienation from our true existence, that kind of existential angst, which Jean-Paul Sartre would put forward later in the century, and Heidegger, that strangeness of existence, and all these thinkers which see terror in alienation. And Chesterton kind of takes the terror out of existence, and he says that there's a kind of adventure in being flung into reality. And for me, this is one of the values of his writing, all the way from the sentence level up through the philosophical level, and a reason that we should take his humor very seriously. And I'm happy to field questions on that, or anything.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yes, feel free, anyone, to put questions in the chat. In the meantime, I'll start with one of my own. Actually, right where you ended, you said that Chesterton manages to take the terror out of existence. The one passage you read about the children on the island, how they're how they can play as recklessly as they wish when there are walls, but then it's the removal of the walls that result in them kind of huddled together in fear of falling off. And that struck me because I I don't think of I don't think of Chesterton as kind of terrified by anything in particular, but that seems to be an image of well, I guess modernity, because he mentions that we no longer have the pleasure of paganism kind of without Christianity. Christianity preserves the pleasure of paganism.
Hmm.
So what kind of precipice, I guess, is he imagining in that image, kind of for modernity or for himself? Like what is he
Yeah,
afraid of?
yeah. So in orthodoxy, he talks about something that he calls the thought that stops thought. Um, he recognizes that skepticism, that is, sort of questioning of everything, fundamental questioning of all fundamentals, which of course was a knee-jerk reaction of intellectuals in the 19th century, eventually leads you to be skeptical of and ask questions of fundamental realities that you need to exist at all. um, so he points in orthodoxy to this article that H.G. Wells wrote called, I think, Skepticism of the Instrument, in which H.G. Wells, I've read the article. It's not a very good one, but in the article, I think it originated as a lecture. Wells questions language itself and says, well, can we really rely on language to convey our meaning? And of course, this became one of the mantras of 20th century philosophy, that language was untrustworthy. This is where Wittgenstein went for a while. This is where postmodernism goes. This is difference, and all the kind of French existential philosophy. That you start to question the instrument itself. But Chesterton says that once you start to do that, if you're free to ask questions, like, does language actually, is it reliable, then you're not free to have a conversation with your family anymore. You're not free to do anything. All you can do is be silent. So he's saying we have to have kind of hard and fast rules about things like language, or else you start to ask questions that destroy everything. He says it's not free for one generation to destroy the next one. They might be exerting their freedom, but in the end, it makes everyone enslaved, or kind of destroys everyone. And in a similar way, it's you're not really being free to ask questions of the fundamental realities that allow us to converse and allow us to think and allow us to kind of move freely. So, of course, in the Christian vision, then we have the language question, especially. I mean, I think he was worried about that. I mean, he saw it coming, that if you start questioning language, you're going to start questioning everything. But Christianity has an answer, and that is the Word made flesh. Language isn't simply self-referential. It refers to Christ. The Word, the Logos of God, the one who spoke creation into being, actually had a body, and walked among us and is among us. So for him, that's the answer. But if you cut that out, if you cut out those walls that Christianity has built, then you just get absolute fear at your own words, at your own utterances, and distrust of your own kind of self and neighbors.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Um, I was wondering, this is kind of more of a personal question, I guess, for you as a reader of Chesterton, but are there any of his reversals that you find especially jolting or kind of actually difficult to take?
I think he can take it too far. um, I find his political vision a little difficult. So he has Chesterton, and I'm trying to frame this in terms of reversal. Everything frames in terms of reversal for Chesterton, if you look closely enough. So, for instance, he praises the French Revolution, and revolutions in general, as kind of helpful or productive. That it's the people reasserting themselves. Again, a revolution is itself a kind of turning. So I think his obsession for reversal could get taken a little too far. And the French Revolution, of course, was a sort of form of reversal, but the worst sort of form of reversal. But I think so. He to use a fashionable Marxist term, he fetishized reversal when it came to, I think, certain things that I find difficult, and that is things like the French Revolution. Um, he called himself a Democrat, and he has some really disturbing um, moments in his work in which he says he calls for revolution in England. He kind of seems to have a sort of bloodlust and says that the people are going to string the aristocrats up. And so I think sometimes his reversals, wanting to sort of make the people the rulers and the rulers of the people, that's the most jolting and troubling thing for me in his work. Difficult for me to kind of stomach, but it's very much kind of his time. I think before World War One, and a lot of those statements come before World War One, it was easy to talk about bloodshed because they hadn't really seen what mechanized bloodshed could look like. It was all cartoon violence to them. And then I think he was a bit more chastened after the First World War and in his politics, seeing the dangers of revolution, watching what happened in Russia. That, yeah.
I think, well, I have one question. Normally I save sort of reading recommendations for last, but maybe we could actually start with that. So many kind of on the call or watching the recording, these are high school students that perhaps have read Orthodoxy, maybe they're first time readers. But yeah, just what's your kind of short list of recommendations, both fiction and nonfiction when it comes to Chesterton?
Yeah, well, Chesterton is best known probably for his detective stories. That is the Father Brown story. So he has a detective sleuth priest. Chesterton thought that a priest would be the best detective because, of course, a priest hears confessions. He hears all the worst things about people's lives. And so he would know human nature inside and out. He would kind of know the criminal mind better than anyone because the criminals have told him all their worst sins. So he has this character, Father Brown, who solves mysteries. Those are a delight. He works through a lot of the same ideas which I'm talking about, just in his plots and various things. For instance, there's a plot called The Invisible Man. I'll just give away one plot, but there are lots of other stories called The Invisible Man, in which a murder is committed by a policeman because the policeman's the, or no, sorry, by a postman, because a postman kind of goes in and out of the building, but no one notices him because he's kind of too obvious to be seen. And too obvious to be seen is one of the great themes that runs through Chesterton. So things are too big to be seen, which is itself a kind of defamiliarizing reversal. You would think that bigness would lead to seeing, but he says no, actually things, when they're too close, you can't see them anymore. And anyway, so Father Brown stories, great. The first book that I started with that I would recommend with Chesterton is Tremendous Trifles. It was a book of essays that came out, I think, in 1907 or 1908. It's a collection of essays that he wrote for the Daily News. He had a weekly column on Saturday in the London Daily News, and they're absolutely brilliant. They're short. They're very funny. They kind of distill so much of his kind of brilliant early vision. So Tremendous Trifles is the essays that I would start with. It's some of his best work. And then Father Brown, and then Orthodoxy. If you like Charles Dickens, I think Chesterton's best book is his book on Charles Dickens called Appreciations and Criticisms. Or no, it's just called Charles Dickens, but he does have another one called Appreciations and Criticisms of Charles Dickens. It was the book that kind of brought Dickens back to the British mind. He had lulled a bit. And even if you don't know Dickens, it's Chesterton works through some of his ideas in probably the most brilliant ways he ever did in that book. So his book on Dickens is very good. Those are the ones I would start with: Tremendous Trifles, Orthodoxy, Father Brown, Charles Dickens. But those are all early, so you'll probably notice that almost all of them happened before 1914. Chesterton had a kind of breakdown, a mental breakdown in 1914. Before then, the story goes that he could dictate to three different secretaries at once, sort of three he could be working on three different things all at once. He had this kind of super brain. After his breakdown, he can only do one, and some people think that he wrote his best work before 1914 and before the breakdown, but he also put out some really brilliant things afterwards, like his biography of Thomas Aquinas, which a number of Aquinas scholars have said is perfect and very good. The Everlasting Man, which is his vision of sort of Christian history. So a lot of good things afterwards. Kind of I suppose those are expected recommendations. Here's an unexpected one. Go look up The Man Who Knew Too Much. So people know Father Brown, but But The Man Who Knew Too Much is another one of his detectives, and I find those maybe even better and lots of fun.
Now, I have another question with sort of the high school students and their parents and teachers that might be listening in. I have them in mind. And you're welcome to sort of skip this question and say, just read some of the books I mentioned carefully, looking for the things that I talked about. But as you were giving your lecture, I was wondering if you might suggest any sort of writing exercises or assignments for a student that's reading Chesterton, maybe playing with reversal or chaos master.
Yes, well, I mean, I think I'm a big believer in imitation exercises. So taking, of course, it's a very sort of classical thing to do, isn't it? But copying out twice, word for word, a passage of sort of 500 words or less, and then trying to imitate its style. So you first break it down, and then you try to imitate its style. Chesterton is actually kind of he's not as open to that as other scholars. I often, or as other writers, I often caution students against trying to imitate his work. He's a bit like Dickens, great to read, dangerous to imitate, because chiasmus and can get gimmicky and cute really quickly in the wrong hands. And a lot of Chesterton's techniques which work because he has a very delicate balancing act in his sentences. If you do them wrong, it gets really difficult. Very similar with Dickens and his exaggerations and things. So first of all, I would caution anyone trying to imitate his style, because it usually just creates a kind of awful pastiche of his work. But yes, so look at chiasmus in his work. Look at different forms of reversal. Look at the way he ends paragraphs. So I suppose if I were recommending one recommending one exercise, I would look at the end of multiple paragraphs and try to do what he does. So he's very good at spiraling to his close. His timing is perfect. I said he's funny, and comedy is all about timing, and that's true in writing as well. So he's very good at, for instance, if you just count the words in a lot of his best paragraphs, towards the middle of the paragraph, you'll have a 25-word sentence, and then you'll have a 20-word sentence, and then a 17-word sentence, and then a 10-word sentence, and then an 8-word sentence, and then the paragraph ends. So he has this sort of siphon movement. It's all very subtle. It's all very brilliant. But he kind of gets you to the end of paragraphs as well as any author I've seen. So that's one kind of practical exercise that you could do. And it's not true of all of his paragraphs, but the ones that kind of strike you most, look at those. And try to imitate the way he's kind of using sentences, that kind of siphoning, the spiraling technique that works so well for him.
That's great. Well, I guess we have time for one more question, and I wanted to ask kind of a broader one, less about Chesterton. So Palm Beach Atlantic, I was wondering if you had anything you kind of wanted to specifically point out about the university for kind of classical school audiences. And then also just any general kind of advice you have for a student searching for colleges, how to approach that.
Well, I would urge you to look at the honors program here. I'm kind of heavily involved in teaching the honors students at Palm Beach Atlantic, and it is a really sound group of young people who love to read, love to learn, do their reading, show up to class, engage with the subjects deeply. And of course, as is true in a lot of small places, the relationships you can build with your professors and mentors is unmatched at larger places. So that's great. Palm Beach Atlantic, of course, is beautiful. Which is good. I mean, it sort of leads to an outdoor lifestyle. If you know the history of universities and pedagogy, of course, pedagogy just comes from our, has to do with our word foot, walking around. And so there's a lot of sort of outdoor instruction, which is wonderfully like Plato's Academy and all the rest. So even though South Florida may not seem kind of have links with ancient Greece. There is something about this setting that is conducive to that sort of walking scholarly existence that's really nice about Palm Beach Atlantic. And then and general advice to people thinking about college is just to read as much as you possibly can. I don't know. It's do what Chesterton did, sort of aspire to the condition of a cow grazing in your reading. Read for the pleasure of the process even more than the product, and that's going to make you a good college student in general. And then once you get to college, treat it like a job. Um, you know, do assignments. Do assignments when you can and not when you have to, kind of thing. Um, just a couple general pieces of advice. But yeah, I mean, the best thing I ever did was just read on my own. I think don't depend on a college education to educate you. You will always be educating yourself and being educated by those around you. Um, but you have to take responsibility for that and start doing it now. It's you won't regret it.
That's so helpful. Well, I think your students are very, very lucky to read texts with you and look at books with you. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a real pleasure.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us to the end. Good night.
Good night.